Welcome to the Eye of the Needle podcast, where we discuss healthcare innovation and explore how visionary entrepreneurs and change leaders are reshaping the future of our industry.
Hello, I'm Pam Arlotto, and welcome to the Eye of the Needle podcast. Before we dive into today's episode, I want to set the stage with something big that's happening at the federal level. In May, CMS and the Assistant Secretary for Technology Policy and the Office of the National Coordinator for HIT released a joint request for information on the future of health technology and its ecosystem. And while we're still in the early feedback stage, it gives us a clear view of where things are heading and what it means for innovators. The RFI points to three major goals. First, a shift from old school point-to-point data exchange to a modern API-first approach using FHIR and other standards. And it's just not about compliance, it's about speed, scale, and accessibility. Second, the RFI expanded on what we mean by data and health data. It's not just structured clinical data from the EHR anymore. It's social drivers of health information, it's behavioral health, cost data, scheduling, even patient-generated health data, and the need for this data to flow across the entire health ecosystem. Finally, the future is all about real use cases for interoperability, enabling patient access, powering digital health applications, and supporting value-based care. We also hope to drive performance through real-time interoperable infrastructure. So the message is clear: legacy tools won't cut it anymore. The next generation of interoperability needs to be modular, standards-based, and built for the patient, not just the provider or a large enterprise. And what's interesting is how this aligns with our journey to high-value healthcare framework that we detailed in episode 1. In recent episodes of the Eye of the Needle, we have discussed how many in the industry are stuck in optimization or 2.0. They're still operating in a fragmented, provider-centric silo. The CMS and ONC RFI suggest a push through mandates and stronger incentives toward the next phase of 3.0, which is about patient-centered, connected care, and ultimately 4.0, where innovation, prediction, and personalization become the norm. These are systems that don't just exchange data, they learn from it, act on it in real time, and reshape how care is delivered. On that note, I'd like to introduce our guest, Greg Stein, CEO and founder of Shadowbox. Greg, welcome. And could you please tell us a little bit about your story, your career path, and what led you to found Shadowbox?
Well, Pam, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be a participant on Eye of the Needle. It's been great getting to know you over the last couple of years as you've been advising and supporting Shadowbox and other technologies within the space. And before I jump into my background, I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of where healthcare is finally going. And I'm excited to talk about that and the role we play in it. But for me, I'm a lifelong entrepreneur. I actually started my first business when I was about 10 years old. I would ride up to the corner store, buy a pack of gum, and then resell each piece to my friends and family. And it was a great business. However, at some point, apparently my prices were a little high, and one of my customers complained to my mom, who then implemented price controls. And then I was exposed to the wonderful world of regulation and how that can affect business. And despite the fact that being entrepreneurial in spirit, I was the founding president of my chapter of my fraternity. I was the co-founder of the UC San Diego Flying Club. I worked for 2 freshman members of Congress, which are both startups. I was a startup in terms of running a campaign. Literally, startup has been in my blood. But I did spend the first part of my career after my undergrad working on Capitol Hill for members of Congress. And it was a very exciting and interesting time for me. I worked for a member of Congress who was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we were in the midst of reformulating rules and regulations around the telecom industry. And so it was a great time to take what was where healthcare is today, if you think about it as an analog, in terms of this is rules and regulations set up for when there were 3 TV channels and 1 radio station in every market, et cetera, and trying to create a framework and a platform for businesses to expand upon and exploit the new technologies of the digital age. And so that kind of systemic sort of thought and opportunity was really inspiring to me. And when I became a district director for one of the congressmen, where I was exposed to innovators who were doing things in real time in defense, in telecom, in healthcare, in biotech, I wanted to be a part of that. So I went back to school, got an MBA, and got involved with a number of different startups, most of which were spectacular failures, and most of which were my fault that they were spectacular failures.
No.
But I would say that ultimately before Shadowbox, and most relevant to it, I was involved with a very early stage diagnostic laboratory. And as with all laboratories and all ancillaries, and quite frankly, as I've learned over the years, all of healthcare, they all are dealing with this massive interoperability problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Shadowbox is designed to fix. And we could talk more about that in a bit.
Okay, that sounds great. So when you kind of were thinking about creating Shadowbox, was there one original pain point or aha moment that inspired the launch of this company?
So there are 2. One was a conversation with a large health system that will go unnamed. There was a clinician there that really wanted to use the test that we offered. And in conversations with that health system, they said, look, we're not onboarding another lab for 2 years. And even when we do start to onboard, it's probably a 6-month to a year process. So we're talking at least 2.5 to 3 years before the first electronic order will come from them.
And that was for when you were at the lab company, correct?
That was when I was at the lab company.
Okay, thank you.
And by the way, that is a story that any of your participants on this podcast and listeners or anybody in healthcare is very familiar with. And I'd love to talk more about why that is. But it became, and so I started Shadowbox around how do we solve the problem of connectivity at scale and at ease. And it became very personal to me actually after I'd started Shadowbox. And that was, I managed to injure myself. I'm into martial arts. I was doing something that injured my lower back. I went to my orthopedic clinician and he did an in-office x-ray and it was inconclusive. So I said, you know what, we really should do an MRI and make sure that whatever's going on isn't something that's extremely serious that we need to deal with right now. And mind you, I'm in extreme pain, as anybody who's ever had back pain can attest to. And so he sent off an order to a imaging center and said, give it at least 2 weeks because the insurance company needs to provide an authorization, right? I happen to have been traveling at that time, lovely time to travel, sitting on an airplane with back pain. And so I scheduled it. The earliest I could schedule was almost 20 days out, 19 days out. 2 days before my appointment, I get a message from the imaging center saying, I'm sorry, the authorization's not there. We need to reschedule you. And so being a relatively intelligent, somewhat highly educated individual who worked in healthcare, I thought I can solve this. And so I called the imaging center and said, what's going on? They said, well, the original order didn't have all the information that we needed. And so we reached back to your sports doc. And so we're waiting for that. So I'm like, oh, I can solve this. I called the sports doc. Sports doc says, no, we faxed that over a couple of days ago. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's just left hand, right hand, not knowing, that the information's already received. So then I called the payer. And the payer said, oh, well, we have a third party entity that is actually reviewing prior auths. And so I don't have real visibility other than I know it hasn't been approved yet. And so here I am, like I said, an advocate for myself in major pain, trying to get the services that I need for my care and my treatment. And I'm thinking to myself, holy cow, what if this was a work comp situation and I actually couldn't go to work and I might lose my house or my car or what have you, or put food on the table? Or what if English wasn't my primary language and I couldn't navigate, or I was a senior and I couldn't advocate for myself. And I think this happens tens of thousands of times every day. And at the very root of it, at the very, very root of it is one thing. And that is that the patient data that lived in the EHR that was critical to determine medical necessity, to validate the need for the test, to provide the service, to get the treatment I needed, was being blocked because it didn't have a way to get there efficiently. It was sent via fax. And so many people deal with how we got this, excuse the language, crappy fax. How do I deal with it? Instead of saying, how do I get rid of the fax altogether? And that's really our mission.
So from what I'm hearing, that's really the problem you created Shadowbox to solve. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement.
Okay. And so once you kind of came to that conclusion, how long after you were at the lab company did you launch the company? Tell us a little bit about, how that worked out.
Sure. So while still at the lab company, I had sort of a strategy role. I wore several hats, but that was one of them. And that, what I described with the health system in terms of 2 years before you're up and running, was endemic. We were doing 400 or 500 traditional unilateral bidirectional HL7s every year. And they were extremely costly, and the ROI was, quite frankly, terrible. It was terrible for lots of reasons. Number one, maybe the patient mix wasn't right and we weren't getting paid for the orders coming through. Maybe the EHR vendor had significant delay or time it took to get them up and running, like I described, or it was just expensive. Maybe the volume wasn't there, or maybe the clinician decided to use a different lab. So the ROI on that, on top of the fact that we had a team in-house that was just churning through HL7. Anytime we changed our test menu, we had to update all of our HL7s. So this is quite some time ago, and we decided, hey, let's build a portal, and that'll solve all our problems. So then we built this beautiful portal, had all this payer logic in it and WalkMe's. It was really well designed. We spent a lot of money on it. And then we said to our sales reps, hey, go request all the docs use this portal. And then we're like, okay, well, now you've got to convince a clinician to swivel chair out of their EHR to a portal. Now they're keystroking data, human error. Now they're like, I'm in a rush. I don't have time to really put all of the information in there. And so now we were getting, even when they used our portal, we were still getting incomplete and inaccurate orders. The other thing is that everybody came out with portals around the same time. And now clinicians being asked to swivel chair, portal to portal to portal to portal to portal. And so that was extremely challenging, low ROI. And so then I sort of had this epiphany. What if you had the EHR open on one side of the screen and the portal open on the other side of the screen, and there was an easy button that just extracted all the data out of one and into the other? And I got together with some really smart engineers, and we invented and created essentially a browser for healthcare. So now, and think about this at scale, every desktop in the world practically has a browser on it. And except for those few systems like in the hospitals where there are applications in there and they're accessing it through an application, most of us, the vast majority of us, are accessing our applications through SaaS applications through browsers. So if we had a browser for healthcare, that was able to extract discrete data that was necessary data and move it from point A to point B to point C to point D through the browser itself, it's a complete paradigm shift in how data is accessed and moved. And that was the concept behind Shadowbox, and ultimately what we patented, the ability to have access when logging into through a Shadowbox browser, access discrete data, all the data elements in a chart, and then use only the necessary data for a particular healthcare service to extract it and move it to where it has to go. And that's what we built, that's what we patented, and that's what we went to market with. And it has been a wild ride.
I'm sure. And you know what's really interesting, when you started talking early on about all the HL7 interfaces and all of that, part of our challenge across the industry, I believe, is interoperability has not delivered on its promise because it's viewed as a purely technical infrastructure issue. And you certainly don't scale that when people don't really understand the business value or the value to the patient or the broader impact on outcomes. And so a lot of data exchange today is either very manual or point to point or fragmented, or it's delayed because it's still being done with faxes. But in reality, it is viewed as very complicated by most business and clinical users or leaders. And people have built workflows, but the workflows have to be changed every time an upgrade happens or an interface happens. And so what we've done a lot of in the industry is build the pipes, but we haven't designed it in a way to make the data useful, either in the care process or in the patient gathering information about their care. And as you well know, most of these interoperability efforts have been EHR centered, not patient or person centered. And so the data may be out there, but if you can't tie it to a specific operational workflow or job you're trying to get done, or certainly when you're trying to coordinate care for one individual across multiple entities or gain new data insights, it's very, very difficult. And so we kind of believe we're kind of stuck in this world, and one of the big pivots is going to be overcoming all of these challenges about the way we've designed interoperability from kind of the beginning. Because most innovators, whether it be digital health or a startup like you or a payer or even a life science companies, they come into this what they think is a connected ecosystem, and then they hit a bunch of walls. So we've built these standards, but people deploy them differently. We have mandates, but there's very, very little enforcement. And so there's this shift that has to happen to go from what I call 2.0, which is basically, still within that silos of care and focused on optimizing the EHR, to really having a connected health system, which is 3.0. And so that's about going from infrastructure to impact and from compliance to usability and ultimately innovation. So beyond what you've just shared, how does Shadowbox help overcome some of these historic interoperability challenges?
Well, I'm going to say something that is probably a little controversial.
That's fine.
And that is this. The entire industry, and even as you described at the beginning of this conversation, is focused on APIs and FHIR as the end all be all and the next 2.0. And I think APIs are fantastic for the EHR companies, because what they've done is, instead of having to do all the integrations themselves with their teams, with their, hey, somebody wants to integrate, set up an analyst, get the HL7 going, they've offboarded that to everybody else. So now they set up APIs, and they say, if you want to be interoperable, you have to connect yourself to our APIs, which is a massive increase in scalability for those that have resources to build and manage APIs. But the problem is that not everybody has that ability or scalability, right?
That's
so
fair.
It's great for Mayo Clinic. It's great for Sutter Health. It's great for anybody connected to TEFCA. But for everybody else, and I mean everybody else, ambulatory surgical centers, laboratories, infusion centers, imaging centers, private practices, behavioral health, treatment centers, homeless. You talked about social determinants of health.
Right.
Homeless centers, diabetes care. None of them have the ability to write APIs and manage APIs across all of these systems.
It's fair.
And
they're
so
not, and most of them are a lot of these players that you just mentioned don't have EHRs. They're not on.
They don't even have an EHR. That's right. That's right.
Right.
And And I haven't even gotten into the hundreds, if not maybe thousands of brand new companies that are coming out that want to access and utilize data through Gen AI and large language models and all of these things as clinical decision support tools, or as early detection, or as support for clinicians to allow them to operate at the top of their license. Like, all of these things need access to discrete patient data, all the data elements that live in the chart, and they need to be able to access that and move that data back and forth. And APIs alone are not the answer. And so when I think about how do you deal with everybody outside the four walls of the acute care hospital system, everybody else, if you had a browser built for healthcare that wrapped around their EHR or their Google Sheets or their homeless management information system, and could rapidly and effectively identify the data elements, and with business logic, move the necessary data elements with some third party or with something we were to build, convert that data unstructured into something that could be coded or is structured, that could be pushed back into an EHR or an HIE in a structured format. Now you're finally getting to that long tail of healthcare. You're getting to the social determinants of health. You're getting to the practices that are simply wanting to operate on their EHR of choice or system of choice, and just don't have the resources to be a part of the big scheme.
So it sounds like your targeted customer are those organizations that still have a lot of the same data sharing needs, but maybe not the level of resources some of the larger enterprises have. Is that a fair assessment? And who are you who are you getting traction with? Maybe that's a better way to ask it.
Yeah, so primarily our customers, we're still a young company, and we went to market in an area where we knew that we had a problem and we're dealing with it. So most of our customers initially were diagnostic laboratories, clinical laboratories that were testing these, bringing to market these amazing proprietary cancer genetics testing, where they're able to identify like esophageal cancer or your prostate cancer, and not just identify, but what is the aggressiveness of the cancer? What are the sort of the genetic makeup of the individuals or the cancers that are going to change the treatment path for them? These are the kinds of tests that make up a huge chunk of our early customers. They're getting 3 orders a week, 5 orders a week, 10 orders a week from clinics, specialties, and it just doesn't pencil out for them to do a traditional integration, or to manage APIs across 500 ordering clinics using 30 different EHRs, of which many of them have different APIs based upon the data you want to pull from them. It just doesn't make sense for them. And so they're using paper and they're using portals, and now they're starting to use Shadowbox. So think about another big subset of our customers are imaging centers. These are, again, freestanding imaging centers. They have orders coming from hundreds of clinicians throughout the community, and their state of the art, as I experienced personally, is an eFax.
Yeah.
And so we're changing that. We are now actually, I'm very excited about this. We are now working with and getting ourselves involved with health systems that have installed plant imaging centers within the health system, laboratories within the health system, that have a robust outreach program. This is especially important in rural areas where there's the only lab in the rural area is the one at the hospital. The only MRI is the one at the hospital, right? So in rural areas where you have clinicians spread geographically everywhere, and you need to get orders in the door, you need to provide treatment. Now we're starting to work with these health systems to support their outreach, to enable data access at scale in a way that doesn't cost $75,000 or $100,000 per practice if they want to extend their hospital-based EHR that shall not be named out to that practice.
Got it. Well, it's interesting. One of the messages I've been trying to get out to other startups or others who want to launch a new company in this industry is you can't just build another mousetrap. You've got to really demonstrate an ROI and or significant value. I talk about 10 times value. I've had several episodes on what it takes to really have a different not just a good value proposition, but a great value proposition. So what are some of the impacts or ROI that you're actually seeing some of these organizations that don't have the big resources? I mean, in those small volume of transactions or orders that they're putting in every week, or are they seeing that reducing that e-fax or doing something outside the traditional portal environment? Are they getting the desired results they hope to see?
Yes, and I'll share some of them. Before I do, though, for all those entrepreneurs out there listening, it takes grit, force of personality, perseverance. Just keep doing what you're doing. It is so important.
Fair.
It is so
Yes.
important that you continue to push the boundaries on what's possible, and especially in healthcare, where so much of what we do in healthcare is it's never been done before, or that's not the way we do it, or we've invested millions in these systems. You've got to continue to push innovation. The system will collapse without innovation. The demographics are not in our favor. The cost of services are not in our favor. The opportunity for these amazing new things coming to market are in our favor, but it has to be done through innovation. So, okay, off my soapbox for that. And let me tell you some of the stats. Because it took the reason I say that is it took us a really long time to get here.
Right.
I mean, I had to convince friends and family, and like, I literally injured
strangers.
myself. Yes, I injured myself and said, I'm an example. Let's do a pilot together, imaging center / sports doc. The data is really, really incredible. So I'll give you some, and we presented this publicly. This is not like, off the top of my head, this is literally publicly stuff with the customers that we did. So at a recent radiology conference with one of our imaging center customers, we demonstrated several things. Number one, 100% of the orders that came through Shadowbox achieved first pass review, whereas they were seeing 40, 50, 60% of fax orders requiring some sort of manual intervention. They get 1,000 faxes a day. The cost to them is easily, just one imaging center, easily over $1 million a year just in that factor alone. We're not talking about the fact that EHR integration fees or blah, 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 all the other stuff.
Right.
On the provider side, it took them 15 to 30 seconds to create a clean, complete order with data that's in the EHR at the time of order, which is what helps make sure that it gets first pass review, saving them 2.5 minutes per order. So if you're a busy
and they're
center,
not swiveling from one system to a portal or one system to another. It's actually happening in their workflow. Is that correct?
happening right in their workflow and saving them 2.5 minutes. So we assumed, given that volume, that we were saving that clinic probably 20 hours a month in terms of just person hours of initial orders and results, not to mention all the rework of, oh, this didn't come through, can you please send us more info? That was something we talked about an early stage of a pilot we did with an imaging center. Jump over to the lab side. We presented at a lab conference a few weeks ago, and that lab, over the course of the year, had implemented Shadowbox in over 50 different clinics using 13 different EHRs with the exact same workflow for the clinics. They did about 23,000 transactions over the course of that period of time. And their cash on cash ROI was over 400%. This is the greatest thing. We were collaborating with their RCM partner to drive a reduction in claim denials across the board. And across the board, they collaboratively 8%. But for those practices ordering through Shadowbox, an additional 12% reduction. So 20% reduction in denials from the payers based on missing, incomplete, or inaccurate information or no medical necessity, 20%. The net change in revenue as a result of that was 13%. So imagine over 23,000 transactions, a 13% net increase in revenue. So it's not just cash on cash in terms of cost avoidance, in terms of no EHR vendor fees or list fees or what have you, transaction fees, maintenance fees, their own internal IT team. But they're also generating higher revenue from the payers because they were getting the right information at the right time for the patient. And on top of all that, and even more important than that, is if you're in the lab industry, you know how hard it is to actually decipher an order to make sure you're actually testing the right thing, especially on those written orders. we're actually providing a much better clinical result in a faster turnaround time. And that impacts patient care.
So you're not just moving data to move data, you're moving it for a very specific purpose and result. That's what I think the next generation is all about. And I think that some of the government, with the things I mentioned at the beginning, this new RFI, they're really trying to, let's not just say, we're exchanging data, but we're actually making something meaningful. We're becoming more efficient, more quality focused, better experience, etc. One of the things we hear a lot these days is that companies won't become successful if they're not platform companies. You can't just build a product to do one thing. It's got to support multiple use cases and workflows. It's got to connect multiple stakeholders and systems and entities. It's got to be configurable based on the needs of different partners. And we've got to, as you mentioned earlier, be able to exchange and aggregate the data so that we can do something with it, like push it through to AI. Do you view Shadowbox as a platform model? And if so, tell us about how that works and what your perspective is on that.
So I've heard you speak previously about a 10x in healthcare, right? Innovation.
Right.
And I believe Shadowbox represents a 10x, maybe 100x, maybe a million X. And the reason I think of that is because, so today, most of our customers are laboratories, imaging centers, et cetera. It's for that direct purpose of moving data for a specific clinical purpose from point A to point B. But you're adding into that compliance. You're adding into that security. Instead of an open browser where you've got Netflix and TikTok and everything else going on in the same space, you're now focusing your clinicians, your clinic staff on the EHR, and they don't have to leave the EHR to be able to do the things they need to do. So you've got compliance, you've got security, you've got scalability, and so those are the things that are sort of the sort of table stakes, if you will, for enabling a clinic to want to install an application on their desktop. But once you have that footprint, once you actually are wrapped around an EHR, you have access to every data element securely, compliantly that lives within the EHR in that patient's chart. Now you can start thinking more broadly. What about every time I put a new script in there, it does a medication reconciliation with a pharmacy? What if every time I took vitals and input the vitals in there or added an allergy, that information is collected and flowed through to an HIE or to their primary caregiver or wherever it may be at a hospital, right? So what if I'm at a homeless shelter and I report that I have a substance use problem, and so I need help on that, and that data can be pulled in. They show up at the ER now, and that data is already a part of the ecosystem. It's a complete continuum of that person's care. I keep wanting to change the terminology from patient care to person care. That person's care, now you have the ability much more quickly to understand the complete holistic situation for that person coming in. So I do think of Shadowbox as a platform, because now that you have access at the time of order, at the time of unaction, at when a patient is there or when the clinician is entering data, now you can think about things like, well, can I add in a clinical decision support tool? Can I add in a prior auth tool? Can I add in or eligibility discovery? What are all the other things that happen after the fact that are high friction, high cost, low return, delay care, worse care, right? What can I add in so that it's part of the system that they're using every single day without having to wait for the EHR to build it into their system? That's the best part, is you unbundle it. You're giving power to all of the innovators all around the world to create these amazing tools, and they can access it without having to go to every single EHR vendor and put it in their platform.
So what you're really doing is setting that platform for significant transformation and innovation and moving the user beyond, well, we have to optimize our EHR to get this incremental change. What you're trying to do is bring transformation and innovation at scale once you're able to help those physicians or those organizations do that initial transaction or order processing, then you kind of take it to the next level. We can do all of these other transformative changes. Is that fair?
We want to empower the clinician to be able to bring to their service and their highest opportunity for quality of care, without having to wait for the EHR to do it. I mean, we've all been in, maybe not all of us, most of us have been in companies, or we were using SaaS products, or we're using applications, and we're like, wouldn't it be great if I could just bring this over here to do this? And then you call up your IT department and they've got a long list of things that they have to do. And maybe they get around to doing it a few years later, and then they roll it out and it doesn't do what you originally wanted it to do. Wouldn't it be great if you could just say, I want to do this and that, and connect it automatically through my browser application called Shadowbox, and away I go.
So how, with this vision and this platform for innovation, how do you avoid being classified as just another middleware solution?
I think the answer to that is the value that we provide.
It's fair. That's good.
And to some extent, it is a middleware, but a middleware ultimately that sits on the desktop as a browser. I'm pretty happy with that as a definition.
That's fair. Okay. Well, so let's segue into some of your lessons learned and your insights and maybe challenges that you've had in your entrepreneurial journey. And if you think, you mentioned earlier, you paused and you gave encouragement to those innovators out there who want to impact this complex healthcare system to, be persistent and stick with it. But what are some hard-earned lessons that you've learned from being in this complex regulated market of healthcare?
That's a really good question. I'm pausing because I feel like I've graduated from the SHK, School of Hard Knocks. I think the most important lesson that I've learned is that you need to be able to speak the language of the people who are on the receiving end of what you're trying to accomplish in a way that demonstrates real value to them. One of the things that we've really worked on at Shadowbox over the last few months is framing Shadowbox not as a technology solution, but as a growth solution, as a interoperability solution, as a means of dramatically improving care for patients. And I think that is a different approach than we've got this whiz-bang technology we patented that does amazing things. It's really not about the technology, it's about what the technology can enable. And if we talk about better patient care, better person care, I should say, if we talk about scalability to be able to bring these amazing tests to market at scale, to be able to demonstrate utility and so that you can get paid, like there's so much that goes behind that. If we could talk in those terms, if we could talk about the fact that we are a connector of best in class, to bring us to the next level. I think you called it 3.0 early on, right? How do we get to best in class? And I think that's really the biggest change, because I can tell you how many pitches I have done as we were out raising money early on, where a doctor would be in the audience. I remember there's one big angel group where I'm from, and it was my worst pitch ever. So again, my fault. Worst pitch ever. The PowerPoint was all messed up and I was inarticulate, but I remember finally getting my point across, I thought, and this doctor raised her hand and said, I like using paper. I'm never going to use that. and it was like just so devastating to me, because the thing that is so frustrating about healthcare is how slow and how stuck it is. And as I mentioned earlier, the demographic wave is already here and it's getting harder.
Yes.
And especially with what we're talking about in terms of change in Washington, I'm a policy nerd, as you know. I'm watching what's happening in Washington. Big change is critical today.
Sure.
I read about hospitals, especially rural hospitals, going out of business. More than half, well, not more than half, probably about half of all clinical labs in the country have gone out of business over the last 2 years. And these things are real. and they're happening in real time. And so to the entrepreneurs out there, framing this as an existential challenge that you're a part of the solution, I think is really important too.
Well, you mentioned that you had to learn to speak the language of those business and clinical leaders out there. And I know that's an essential part of building trust with those future buyers. But are there any other things that you've found helpful in building a trusting relationship so that they are willing to work with a startup, with a new company? Because often, one of the most frequent questions we get as consultants is, who else have they worked for? And sometimes you're new to their space. So what are some kind of ways that you've worked to build that trust?
I think the primary way I have done so, two ways. The first is we have an ethos at Shadowbox of establishing channel partnerships with like-minded innovative companies in the space that collaboratively create exponential value. An RCM company, a lab information management system company, et cetera, collaborating together, as I mentioned that we presented at this lab conference, can do more for a customer than each of us individually, or competing with each other or fighting with each other. Even companies that purport to provide the exact same service we do and none do, because we're a unique patented application, but we still want to work with them because they have their sweet spot, we have our sweet spot, and we want to collaborate with them on the best interest of our customers. And when you have that ethos and you present that to customers, they see you as more than a vendor. They see you as a strategic partner. And so that's number one. Number two is I lean back on my history in legislative affairs and policy, and I speak to the things that are greater than that particular company's next day. How do they keep their doors open? It's what is happening in the industry, what's happening in terms of regulation, what's happening in terms of legislation, and what can they be doing to be aware of it and address it in a constructive way. Most of the operators that I know have no idea, and they're busy running their businesses, right? And so when I can present to them this, hey, let's talk about the No Surprise Billing Act. Let's talk about the Cures Act and how these things can be regulatory and compliance challenges, or they can be regulatory compliance opportunities. How do you work within that? How do you have your voice heard? So many companies are just focused on, like I said, the day-to-day. They aren't realizing how powerful their voice can be if they just go say what's important to them. And we're starting to see some of that in some of the space I'm in, but there's a lot of noise out there. And so part of the value that I can help bring is, how do you cut through that noise so that your voice is heard with the right people in the right place to help make a difference?
So given your background in policy and interpreting regulatory changes, do you think today's current regulatory environment, and when I say today, I'll say the last 10 years and maybe even some of the changes the new administration is exploring, I mean, is it welcoming to startups and innovators, or are new players still at a disadvantage from what you've seen?
It's welcoming to innovators. It's exciting to innovators to see that the regulatory framework is being changed. When I read the Cures Act, and actually I want to pull it up because I think it's so important. I actually have this section in Title IV. Like, this is a huge, I don't know, maybe 1,000-page act, but in Title IV, Section 40002, they're talking about application programming interfaces, and it allows for health information to be shared, accessed, exchanged, and used without special effort through the use of application programming interfaces or, and I bold this, successor technology or standards, and as provided for under applicable law, including providing access to all data elements of a patient's electronic health record to the extent permissible under applicable privacy laws. That right there, as a policy guy, as an innovator, and as a CEO of a startup, that is a green light that says it's time for change. And I saw the RFI come out. I know the Energy and Commerce Committee has asked for requests for their own RFI on how they can advance interoperability. These are things that we need to be persistent about. Now, how is that working in the real world, right? With the incumbent players. And I don't blame the incumbent players. They have invested millions, tens of millions,
Right.
maybe even
Right.
hundreds of millions, right, in their systems. And they're under constant cyber threat. They're under constant pressure in terms of reimbursements. Like, their world is not an easy place to be, without a
Right.
doubt. But I believe, or I hope, maybe I hope that these pressures are finally going to force the type of change that truly get us to value-based care, that get us to patient-centered care, that get the complete continuum of care from the social determinants of health, that bring true interoperability, because without it, they won't survive. So I'm hopeful, but I can tell you that I have, despite my legislative policy background and all that I'm doing and the traction, we're venture funded and all of the stuff that we have done and the visibility, like speaking at conferences and all these things, I still cannot get a seat at the table in any of the organizations at the federal level, and I've tried at the state level, because healthcare is so big that when you're not running hundreds of millions of dollars worth of revenue, you're just not considered, it's just not given the opportunity to be at that same table. And it's not just me, there's hundreds of companies just like me that want to just share exactly what it is that we're doing and why it's so important. And there isn't that, and we got to keep trying. That's the other message. Like, we got to keep trying. I love this podcast. Maybe it's the platform that will finally get us to break through the noise on that. But legislators, regulators, and big companies need to listen to what we're doing, because we are going to save them.
Well, and that's why we named this podcast The Eye of the Needle, because we have all these problems and challenges on one side, and then all of these innovations on the other, and all these new thinkers and startups and venture funded initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. But getting these solutions together with the problems is like going through the eye of the needle. It's very, very, very difficult. And so, you hear quite frequently that, the incumbents are really throwing cold water on innovation, but I really like the way you explained it. It's not that they're against innovation. They just have their own investments, their own processes, their own contracts, their own, they're living within an existing system as well. And it's really a lot about the incentives wherever you sit in that system that make change so difficult. So I appreciate that you're encouraging others out there, don't give up, be persistent, and that the true opportunity does still exist out there to drive it, the change and the innovation. So one of the goals of this of the RFI that came from CMS and ONC is to really empower patients more with access to their data. I did a podcast with Kristen Valdez, who's the founder of Be Well Health, and she has a great story she tells about the care of her daughter and a medical error. In other words, data between two systems that didn't communicate with each other, almost killed her. And it's a very powerful story, and that's why she launched her company. Do you believe that we are making progress with getting the right data to patients, or at least allowing patients to influence that? When you talked about all the calls you made and trying to get your MRI, are patients still having to struggle to that level, or do you think progress is being made?
I think progress is being made, but I find it to be incremental. And I find the workload still to be on the responsibility of the patient or the person themselves. Even though there's access to a chart or access to an application on their phone or whatever, that data is not aggregated for that person. And And I believe that some of the largest companies in the world have tried to accomplish this. And I believe that they have so far failed. And I'm not sure what the solution is today. I'm concerned about the idea of forcing all data into a single database. Because I feel like when you have a one-size-fits-all solution, that locks you into that solution. I truly believe that innovation comes from competing interests working to achieve exponential improvements. And so I was literally having this conversation at a conference a couple weeks ago where wouldn't it be great if we just had one EHR? And I don't think that that's the answer.
Right.
But how do we get the data? And so the methodology that Shadowbox has employed through our architecture is data in this application is a source of truth for that application for that patient. And data in this application is a source of truth for that patient. And if you can bring all of these sources of truth into a single pane of glass and layer intelligence on top of it, now you actually have the ability to have a complete continuum of care, complete visibility that tells the complete story of that person without having to try and marry all the databases together.
And if we want to truly personalize care based on the individual needs of each patient, that one size fits all solution will not work. It's going to have to be some level of mapping and design based on those unique needs and that whole person perspective in the future. We talk about it all the time, but one size fits all won't do that for sure.
Well, some people ask me, how did Shadowbox get its name? And yes, I'm into martial arts, and shadowboxing is a practice.
Right.
But what a shadowbox is, and why we named the company the way it is it's a form of art. And you think about a shadowbox. What is a shadowbox? A shadowbox, you think about it typically in the military, domain where somebody has a flag, and then they have their medals, and then they have a picture, and then they have a commendation. Each of those boxes individually are a set of data that when you bring them together in a shadow box, they tell a complete story.
I love that.
And so Shadowbox is designed to create that complete story for clinicians. We aren't designed to achieve the ultimate goal at this point in providing that same story for the patient. And again, like I said, I'm not sure how we'll get there. I do think it's a possibility, but if we can at least get it to the clinicians at the time of service, when that patient's standing in front of them, to access all that data and layer intelligence on top of it to provide the most important critical intervention necessary for that patient at that time, that we will dramatically advance care.
Makes sense. So let's close. We're kind of coming to the end of our time. Let's close with a few rapid fire questions and your response to them. So let's start. What is one book or concept that has shaped how you lead at Shadowbox and in the other previous stages of your career?
So Morning on Horseback is a biography by David McCulloch of President Theodore Roosevelt as a youth, and there's actually a couple of books in that series. And Teddy Roosevelt is probably the most incredible and amazing story from a child who was unhealthy as a child, had these massively diverse interests, collecting insects, and to all of that, to traveling the world, becoming worldly, to ultimately his first job in the state of New York, to working on civil service reform, to, ultimately becoming the president of the United States throughout. But this is a person who has overcome adversity. Yes, he came from a wealthy family. It wasn't like he was, needy in that respect. He had opportunities provided to him because he was wealthy, but he was truly a Renaissance person. He, very inspiring. So anyways, Morning on Horseback. I love to read biographies, and there's 100 business books I could share, but I felt like that was a little different than what some of your guests might say. Truly an inspiring story.
So if you could only bust one myth about interoperability in the healthcare industry, what one would you choose?
It's possible, and it's happening now.
In other words, the myth is that it's not possible and it's never going to happen. Is that fair?
That's correct.
I got it. Okay. Does AI fit into the future of Shadowbox?
You bet.
Okay.
Absolutely. I can't share exactly how because there's a patent pending, but it's
Perfect.
super exciting. Yes.
Yes. Where will you be in 10 years? Where will Shadowbox be?
On every desktop and laptop and mobile device throughout healthcare.
And what is the one thing that we didn't talk about today that we should have?
Ooh. We didn't talk about your journey and your perceptions on some of the things that I was saying. You didn't course correct me. You did, those are things that I think would have been fascinating. We could probably spend several more hours talking about.
Well, that'll be the next episode. How's
Okay,
that?
there we go.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much. And it's exciting hearing about your journey and the direction. And I look forward to you digging in to the policy of the new administration and maybe even how you respond to their RFI, because it'll be fascinating to see if the accelerator gets pushed a little bit more.
That would be great. Well, Pam, thank you so much for having me on as a guest. True pleasure.
Thanks so much.